I'd like to welcome everybody to session 6 of our Convocation, where we're still continuing our discussion about investment, finance, politics, economics. And before we do commence on just to our acknowledgement of country. So as we gather, we acknowledge the first peoples of this land that we now call Australia. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and commit ourselves to ongoing relationship and reconciliation with the land and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. May we continue to listen to and learn from the first peoples about how to truly live in harmony with creation. Our Convocation session 6 continues the discussion about the ways in which we can come together as a whole of Catholic Church of Australia and enact change. Catholic Earth Care devised this convocation probably 12 months ago now. And during that period of time, we've gone through lots of changes. One of those changes has been that we've been brought into greater relationship with Caritas Australia, Caritas being the international aid and development arm of Catholic Church of Australia. Catholic Earth Care is now a program of Caritas, and this convocation is generally supported by Australian Catholic Superannuation and Retirement Fund, of which I see Earth Care and their ethical investment side having a great relationship. Both personally but also professionally, because that's what we would be very interested in ourselves. I would first like to introduce our panellists today to our audience, and I'm going to do a general introduction, the big introduction now, because then we're going to move into a bit of a reminder on why we're in this space. So today, welcome to Bruce Duncan. Bruce was ordained a Redemptorist priest in 1971 and specialised in the area of social justice, and later studied economics and political science at the University of Sydney. Since 1986, he's taught social justice studies at Yarra Theological Union. He was a member of the Melbourne Catholic Commission for Justice, Development and Peace from 1994 to 2007, and also worked in Catholic social services until this time. Welcome, Bruce, and thank you. Bruce is stepping in for John Ferguson from the Social Justice Office of the Catholic Church of Australia, was unavailable for today. So thank you very much, Bruce, on short-term notice to come in today.
That's a pleasure.
Louise, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Louise Bradshaw is the Australian Catholic Superannuation's first dedicated ESG investment professional. And as the fund's ESG officer, Louise is leading the development and integration of ESG strategies at both a project and micro level. So welcome, Louise, and thank you for being with us. Michael, welcome.
Thanks very much, Bernard, for having us.
Thank you. Michael is the Chief Investment Officer for Australian Catholic Superannuation, which is a $9.5 billion industry super fund, and they themselves are going through their own merger over the next couple of years with non-government super and be a much more powerful player in this field. Michael comes to us after 40 years in the Australian financial services sector, and has held a diverse range of positions across investment banking, government, and funds management. So thank you, Michael, for being with us today.
Pleasure, Bernard.
We would now just like to set the context with a video that Caritas generated about a year ago, talking about how we need to care for our common home. And it's from a little sub-program we've been running called Generation Earth. So thank you, Claire.
This is our living world.
And this living world is our common home.
Our one and only home.
Home to my people, who have lived in harmony with this sacred land for tens of thousands of years.
And home to my people, for whom Mother Earth has always provided food, shelter, and a sustainable life.
But our precious home is facing an urgent threat.
Large polluting companies are causing catastrophic damage to our Earth's climate and destroying our land, sea, water and air.
The land that provides for us.
The sea that connects us.
The water and air that keep us alive.
Some of us are only just waking up to the consequences of the short-sighted decisions being made by a powerful minority.
But for millions of us across the world, the impacts of climate change have already been devastating.
Our family and most of our community were forced to leave our island because sea levels are rising so fast.
We might never be able to return.
On our mobbed ancestral homelands, mining and gas companies are killing the soil and poisoning the water. They're making our people sick.
The land that my family has been working on for generations has become so impacted by drought, it's become very difficult to make a living.
Many of us who are living with the devastating impact of climate change are working very hard to heal our earth and to give our children and grandchildren a brighter future.
But we can't do it alone.
We are all brothers and sisters, and we must work together to take care of our human family and to protect our living world.
We have the power to choose a brighter future where everyone has clean energy.
But only if each and every one of us stands up and takes immediate action.
For me.
For me.
For my children.
For my grandchildren.
For all of us.
And for the only home we have.
Thank you, Claire. The message is clear that we must come together, and the whole message of our convocation is to bring our hearts together to care for a common home. In our first section today for session 6, we're going to focus on our social and moral responsibility. And we're going to go back to the Social Justice Statement of 2017 and 18, which is titled Everyone's Business, Developing an Inclusive and Sustainable Economy. And this will help set the scene, for which then Bruce will then comment on and make further insights on that statement. Thank you, Claire. Thank you, Claire. Well, Bruce, someone described you last week as you being the godfather of social justice in Australia. I don't know whether that's true or untrue or flattering, unflattering, but welcome today, and I appreciate your comment on how we can bring about a sustainable and fair economy.
Yes, thank you, Bernard. But what a splendid, really splendid and well-presented little video of which captured, I think, so much of the encyclical itself. And some of the points it was raising are worth dwelling on. It echoes very much what Pope Francis has been saying about highlighting the two great issues of our time, climate change and of course, growing inequality, which he's very worried about. And the climate change after the bushfires we had just at the start of this year, we're all very aware of those. And we see them happening again in California, most astonishing, unprecedented fires beyond anything else they've experienced in their history. So Pope Francis uses the phrase to be aware of catastrophic change with the climate change. And he keeps using that phrase. And it's a phrase not only he uses, but the Secretary General of the United Nations, Guterres, Antonio Guterres, he also warns about that. So, and with the climate scientists, the man who helped write his encyclical Laudato Si was Professor Schullenhuber from the Potsdam Institute in Germany, one of the leading experts in the world. And so Pope Francis has surrounded himself with all the leading experts and is taking their advice on this climate change, but also on the economic issues. Because what he sees happening in the United States and in Europe now, a growing inequality between the very rich and the ordinary people. We talk of in Australia about the hollowing out of the middle class, and more so in the United States, where the average wage earner, male wage earner, hasn't had a pay rise in 40 years. This is most astonishing. And Jeffrey Stiglitz wrote his book, or the article of the 1%, for the 1%, by the 1%, about how the money has been accumulating in the billions, or hundreds of billions of dollars in the hands of a very small elite group who now control enormous power over the international economy. And he's saying that this is a disaster unfolding behind us because it robs people of agency, of a feeling of belonging, and of the right to a just wage. And some people will say, well, why is the church involved in this sort of economic debate? And Pope Francis is very strong on this, and it's not just Pope Francis. Every pope since Leo XIII for 130 years has said this. Every person has a right to a just wage, enough to supply themselves with, we would understand it as support their family adequately, raise and educate their children, and have home ownership, like possibly at the end, like hopefully the end of their working life. Well, that's not happening now. More and more people we're seeing working in the gig economy on part-time wages, casualised wages. The unemployment is still very strong, and of course with the COVID crisis now, this has made everything absolutely so much worse. So from having under 750,000 unemployed at the time of this statement, it's now well over 1 million, and could go to 2 or 3 million, depending on how the government plays out with its JobKeeper and JobSeeker payments. So this is a very serious situation. And what Pope Francis is saying is we need a new type of economy. We need to revise the economy. And in the words of Bishop Vincent Long, who was the bishop responsible for the social justice statement, he says, developing a new economic model with a balance between the market, the state, and civil society is not revolutionary. This is a vision that Catholic social teaching has been working towards for well over a century. So a new economic model which balances all these factors. The market has a definite role to play, of course, but the market is not self-regulating. And lots of economists are saying this, the whole policies of the economic rationalism, or neoliberalism as we call it today, has been to demolish and unconstrain the power of the market in an unregulated way so that it doesn't work for everybody. It's working for the few. And Pope Francis said, no, we've got to change it so that it's working for everybody.
Ruth, that was very much echoed by both Ross Carnot and Tim Buckley in previous sessions. I'm just wondering, is there anything that you see that we could be doing in this post-COVID economic revival which does address the equity issues?
Yes, there's a long list of things that we can do. Most immediately, and many of the economists are talking at the moment, is that the government must continue to support JobKeeper and JobSeeker as long as possible, particularly JobSeeker, because the unemployment benefits were scandalously low, $40 a day. You cannot get lodging anywhere for $40 a day, much less live on $40 a day. They've increased it since, of course, with the JobSeeker allowance. But they're going to stop it, lower that at the end of September. Well, this will make it very, very difficult for people on unemployment allowances. So we're pleading that they do not reduce that allowance, because there are going to be so many people unemployed. What is going to happen to them? The second thing we need to do, the government needs to do, is to get infrastructure programs underway, and particularly housing, public housing. This is the great crisis in our country that's been steamrolling us along for a long time and keeping people. We've locked out a whole generation of younger people, the possibility of owning their own home. This is an astonishing thing in Australia. And we have the highest, one of the highest housing costs in the world, and yet we have this vast continent we're living on the edge of. And what the economists and the housing people are saying is that, for heaven's sake, we need to put money into housing, and this can be done very quickly. It will employ a lot of people. It will employ a lot of businesses with the goods and services required, and it will house a lot of people. It will help solve a problem that it is just growing and growing, and is one of the major causes of poverty and social distress in this country.
Particularly as a segue into our next session, where do you see a role in financial institutions in this post-COVID recovery?
Well, nothing can happen without the support of financial institutions. And it's very interesting with Pope Francis. He's been talking with the leading economists, the leading business groups and others. And he's very aware that finance is really, it's the lifeblood of the economy. If we haven't got good financial institutions behind us that are choosing, not exploiting people, but choosing good projects, are investing, they're concerned to improve the human well-being of the whole community. They have that as a core objective in their planning and the choice of projects. Then the church is not going to tell business people or investors how to invest their money, but they are going to put up these criteria. You know, what advances human well-being? And I think most business people there really want to do this. But what has happened is that there's a market mechanism, you know, the Wolf of Wall Street, all this sort of just maximizing profits in the short term. It's going to be a terrible trap for us if we keep going down that way. And Francis is very strong on speaking against that sort of overpowering, the worship of the golden calf, he calls it, in a new form.
And a question from our listeners at the moment. Social housing is a no-brainer. How can we gain the ear of our politicians? Can we work alongside secular organisations?
You asking me that?
Yes, yes.
I thought you were asking the audience. this is very difficult. It means we need to talk to our local politicians. We need to have go with people who know the particular field that you're concerned about, so that you can speak with some confidence what you're saying, and also as insight. So, and particularly if you go to the politician, I mean, politicians are just ordinary people, they're looking for answers too. If you can go with a suggestion which says, now we've got a suggestion about a way forward here. That's what they want to hear. And if they can pick up something that they can take back into their party and into their discussions with their advisors and so on, say, what about this? Well, can we do this? So it's certainly expressing our concern and how widespread is this concern in the community, and politicians will certainly be wanting to respond to that, but also secondly, how to do it.
That's great. Thank you very much, Bruce. Your comments there about corporations wanting to do the right thing and requiring a framework to do that, that leads beautifully into Louise's session. So welcome, Louise, to give us a bit of a rundown on what are these basics about ESG, the environmental, social and governance structures with corporations.
Thanks, Bernard. Thanks, Bruce. So my role today is to give an introduction, if you will, on responsible investing and ESG. So I hope I'm not too basic for everyone, but I thought I'd start at first principles. So this term ESG has been growing in significance amongst institutional investors like ourselves and retail investors for quite some time. And in recent years, the adoption and the application of ESG has seen quite a rise in assets under management within the ESG space. Now, much of this has been accelerated as our world is changing, society's changing, norms are changing, they're shifting, and there's a lot more availability of objective and financially relevant data that's able to support this approach, which there hasn't been in the past. It's also the case that there's a growing scrutiny on ESG related issues by our regulators and policy makers, and we as investors need to factor this in as well. So going way back, the practice of ESG started in about the 1960s, and it was termed socially responsible investing back then. So what does ESG investing look like today? Well, it's used as a term synonymously with things you may have heard of before: sustainable investing, SRI, socially responsible investing, RI, responsible investing, impact investing, and screening. Responsible investment, which I guess is the overarching phrase for all of this, is a strategy and a practice that aims to incorporate ESG factors into investment decisions. By adopting a responsible investment approach, it's about minimising exposure to financial and non-financial risks that fall under the term ESG. So increasingly now, investors are not only looking to minimise the ESG risks in their portfolio, but they're also looking to take advantage of ESG opportunities that are starting to mushroom in our industry. So really the objective for us as institutional investors is to deliver strong returns while having a positive outcome on society and the environment. And you may have heard of the term triple bottom line, and that stands for people, planet and profit. So just to break down ESG, I'll just take each letter in as a standalone. The E stands for environmental, obviously, and investors like us and all over the industry are focused on issues like emissions, energy management, waste, pollution, natural resource conservation, water management, and animals. And you know, more recently, you will know that Rio Tinto has been caught in amongst this with the destruction of the Yukon Gorge area. So that would fall under an E scenario. S stands for social, and this is an area that has a strong focus at the moment for investors during the COVID crisis. There's a focus as Bruce has said, on human rights, working conditions, pay structures, product quality, safety, privacy, data security, workplace safety. So another example of the S would be the recent scandal in the UK with the clothing retailer Boohoo, that's facing modern slavery investigations after underpaying its staff under the minimum wage and having non-social distancing practices in its factories during COVID. G stands for governance. So the premise here is that companies that are well managed and exhibit ethical behaviour and sustainable behaviour and good corporate governance will perform well in a sustainable manner in the future, in the long term. Issues that come under governance, well, you know, the Royal Commission is the first thing, gender diversity, board diversity, structure, executive pay, bribery, corruption, supply chain management. And you could probably pick off a handful of recent events that come under the G, but AMP and QBE might be the most recent examples of that. So there's a number of organisations that work as a collective where super funds and institutional investors can become members to work collaboratively on ESG related issues. And these organisations focus on various themes within the responsible investment arena, both broadly and separately: climate, engagement, modern slavery. I'm not going to go through them all, but the most prominent of these for us is the Principles of Responsible Investing, the PRI. And that's an organisation that represents over 3,000 institutional investors globally. And it's a force for policy and advocacy in representing the long-term interests of its signatories and of the financial markets and economies in which they operate. So signatories, of which our fund is one, commit to 6 principles, which are aspirational in aiming to incorporate the ESG issues into their decision-making processes, becoming active owners, promoting the principles within the industry, and providing transparency in their activities via an annual reporting program. As part of adopting a responsible investment strategy to incorporate ESG into investment decisions, investors also look to take a more active control of the assets they own. So active ownership, as we term it, is an important part of ESG adoption. Active shareholders discuss E, S and G concerns with the companies in which they invest, with the aim to preserve the long-term shareholder value and enhance the long-term returns. But these discussions can be very effective as a two-way street in influencing companies' behaviours and companies being aware of what investors are looking at. So there's 2 mechanisms that you can actively exercise your rights as a shareholder. One is the physical voting at shareholder meetings, which we do mostly via a proxy scenario. And the other one is engagement and having an active dialogue with the investment companies. So voting and engagement are often utilised in a combined manner. Investors' relationships with the companies via multi-year engagement programs often inspire trust between both parties, and there's a lot of collaboration more and more as the years go on. I think companies are aware now that investors aren't going to go away in some of their concerns, and they need to start to listen. And we've seen many examples of that recently. BHP, AGL, all committing to net zero emissions. These were all on the back of very heavy-duty investor engagements with these companies. Together, being used in combination, voting and engagement can strengthen each other as well. And it becomes more simply just than casting a vote. It's as I said, it's a mechanism to exchange views between the organisations. So I think lastly, another tool in the toolkit of an ESG investor is to screen out investments. And you may have heard of this term, negative screening. And this is done to send a message to a company or an industry in an untenable position. It's an approach of last resort for most investors. The approach of voting and engagement is preferred over divestment. But the argument against screening, if you will, is that if you're invested in a company with a shareholder status, sorry, if you aren't invested in a company and you don't have shareholder status, i.e. you've divested, you won't have any mechanism to influence their behaviours going forward. So once you sell your stake, another investor, perhaps who's less interested in ESG practices, may purchase the stock, and they'll make no attempt to influence the behaviours of the company in a positive manner. So by continuing to own the shares in the company, you have the ability to vote, engage, and work towards making a positive change in their practices. And that has happened and is happening regularly with corporates. There are some exceptions, of course, to what I've just described, and that would be in industries where there's no evidence that their business model is sustainable, where there's it's nigh on impossible that a company will change its behaviour, or a company that hasn't reacted to an engagement program. And an industry like that would be tobacco. There's a huge public cost, a health cost from the production. The industry can't change its business model due to the nature of what it produces. And there's been no ability to influence tobacco industry's behaviours over the years with engagements. So in this case, screening out tobacco is the last resort. There's also a financial point of view here, that there's no evidence that tobacco has added any additional performance to an index over the last 20 years or so. So screening it out doesn't impair performance. And similar situation would be with controversial weapons and cluster munitions. So just to sum up, the focus on ESG is accelerating due to climate change, rapid developments with society, and regulatory scrutiny. There are more practical reasons to employ ESG beyond just ethical. Investors don't have to sacrifice returns. Avoiding companies with poor ESG risks will avoid losses. Think of Volkswagen, for example. There's increasing expectation that ESG becomes more integrated within investment portfolios, and there's a growing scrutiny by policymakers and regulators. And there are organisations that help our investors, and we have a collective voice to progress the issues within the ESG space. So at that, I'll stop and thank you.
Thank you very much, Louise. Could I refer back to our the Jucan Gorge caves? We've seen a lot of fallout just over the weekend in that area. There's a quote from The Guardian that says, "So long as the money kept flowing, there's always a blind eye that could be turned." I don't think we're in that space anymore. Are you able to elaborate perhaps on the failures in the corporate life, particularly perhaps in Rio Tinto or another company, and where those failures happen within the ESG topics?
Well, I'm not intimate with all the details, but I have listened to a lot of webinars about this situation. And it sounds to me like there was quite a great dialogue between Rio Tinto and the Indigenous peoples over time. And there was a change at the executive level where things started to fall apart a little bit. And so I think, it sounds like the culture of Rio within the executive ranks started to change, and things started not being listened to. And, that's the same with many companies that have fallen foul of late. Culture and the G, and indeed the S, seem to, trip up these organisations, and they're not listening. And like I said, societal norms are shifting.
Yeah, and I believe it was a lot of large superannuation companies that were forcing their opinions onto the board of Rio Tinto, which then had another consequence for their executive levels and future employments.
And that is why the institutional investors prefer engagement and dialogue and voting over divestment, because they can see increasingly now they're able to make drastic changes for the good.
Okay, and as members of the public, some of us maybe within clergy or religious life not have superannuation. Some of us do have superannuation, some of us may hold shares. what is it that you think we could do as ordinary citizens to keep this conversation going with the corporates? When we don't sit on boards, we don't have representation at those meetings.
I might leave Michael to answer that one.
Thank you, Louise. Thank you, Bernard, for the question. Let me give a little bit of background, but I will get to your question directly. And that is that, remember that superannuation itself is a form of social justice. In the early 80s, when NatSem and other organisations were first mooting the idea of super, the only people in Australia that really had superannuation were politicians and people in the upper echelons of banks. And so in and of itself, the idea to allow people to provide the superannuation and provide a means whereby they can retire with dignity in itself is a great form of social justice. And we, that's Louise and I, are very proud to represent Australian Catholic Superannuation, Australia's only and largest superannuation fund for the education sector. And we believe that there is never any excuse for acting unethically or doing the wrong thing. And we would now point to something along the lines of that it is possible to be a good corporate citizen, to be a steward for both the financial retirement savings of our superannuation members and of the community generally, and do the right thing. And case in point, Louise is the portfolio manager of our responsible investment option, which was introduced in 2002, so it's getting on to be nearly 19 years old now. And you can do good and do well in a financial sense because it's the highest returning of our options and has done very well across this COVID period. So how can ordinary members of the public and me and you and everybody else who is listening help us in this journey? Well, the most obvious thing is to vote with your feet. And what that would mean is if people belong to our superannuation fund, which is an ethical fund, and we are just continuing our journey into having a larger ESG footprint. So thank you very much to our chairman, David Hutton, who supported our initiatives in employing Louise as our first full-time ESG officer. But we are reading the messages loud and clear from all of our stakeholders that just having a small ESG option on the side of our super fund is not enough. We need to mainstream ESG into everything that we do. That doesn't just mean the companies we invest in. It also means ourselves as people and what we do on a day-to-day basis in the fund. So in very simple terms, who you bank with, who you put your super with, where you shop, how you relate to your local politician, these are all things that can put pressure on organisations to behave in a better way. And they don't necessarily have to do it in a way that's detrimental to the community, to the environment, because as I've shown you, you can act in an ethical and responsible way as a steward of this community, of our planet, and still get a result that's just for everybody.
Thanks, Michael. So are you saying that superannuation companies, most of them have a responsible investment line for people to nominate as for their share portfolio or their investment line? Are you saying that Australian Catholic Superannuation Retirement Fund are now putting ethical investment across all portfolios?
I would love to think, Bernard, that we were already a highly ethical and highly responsible superannuation fund in the first instance. Our responsible investment option is for those that want to make a really strong statement in relation to ethical considerations, notwithstanding the rest of the fund was still ethical and responsible in what it did, but we are making a much greater effort in that area. And to give you some examples, we have hired ESG managers in certain strategies. So for instance, about 25% of our emerging markets are run according to ESG principles. we have started to move away from energy production that involves fossil fuels into renewables, and we seeded the Australian Renewables Infrastructure Fund ourselves. We are investing in more and more fund managers that excise miners and other things. We have negative screens, not just against tobacco, but also against controversial weapons and other things that we don't see as the right thing to do. And yes, absolutely, we intend mainstreaming ESG across everything we do, including all of our investments. Early days, but if we can already point to reduction in fossil fuel exposure, increase in renewables, increase in clean energy, increase in sustainable agriculture, working with our Indigenous brothers, including the Aboriginal Carbon Fund and other places like that. We have a reconciliation action plan that's been improved. So we think we're well on the way to doing the right thing, and we think our members will benefit from it, not just in a social and responsible way, but also will ultimately get better returns and at lower risk. And let me just try and give some of your listeners an idea of what I'm saying. Does it make sense to think that companies that are well managed will do better? Sounds pretty sensible to me. Does it make sense to say that if we divest or take steps to not hold large amounts of our assets in areas where they could become stranded assets, for instance, fossil fuels and those companies? That would make sense to me. Does it make sense for Louise to continue in our initiatives to fight against modern slavery, such that, you know, we would not suffer any reputational damage, and it doesn't make sense to invest in companies that breach their responsibilities in that area? I think most of this is just really common sense, and it's also for the common good. So we will continue moving in that direction.
Thank you, Michael. A few little questions are popping up online, which I'll go to. There's a whole issue. We've been pushing hard within Caritas for a couple of years now for the Catholic Church to divest all its interest in fossil fuels. There is some intel coming through, and Tim Buckley alluded to this, that it's already too late to even think about that because the investment is so strong in the renewables that the actual traction with the investment thing is, the need is now so small. I don't know. From your point of view of investment, is divestment still an issue worth pushing with our church organisations?
I think that the issue of engagement and divestment and the financial returns from both paths is something well worth considering. As Louise said, divestment is something that is an option available to stakeholders to take advantage of if they think it's the right path. Personally, I think that one should divest from all actions and all products that are known to be harmful, and clearly tobacco, controversial weapons, and other things fit into that category. In the case of fossil fuels and things like that, I think one needs to take a slower approach than instant divestment. And the reason is that we are still reliant upon fossil fuels to some extent, and it is not possible straight away to replace them with renewables, solar, wind, etc. But certainly I would like to do everything that we can to make that change happen as soon as possible. So in the short term, we're using reduction in fossil fuels, moves towards renewables and clean energy, and putting pressure on companies to do better in that region. But absolutely the long-term aim of our fund is to consider reduction in certain fossil fuels and ultimately maybe even all fossil fuels.
Yeah, because APRA, Tim Buckley raised this the other day, that APRA says companies must evaluate their climate change challenges and prudential risk. How do superannuation companies in general do this?
Well, first and foremost, when deciding what a superannuation fund allocates money to for the benefits of its retirees, for its members, in order for them to retire with dignity, we balance the risks and returns from every form of investment. One of the things that has come out of this tragedy of COVID is it's meant that there are lots of changes to things that we have done. This is a massive social and economic change. And as an example, if we are working from home 2 days a week, that's going to mean massive reductions in congestion, petrol usage, transport, etc., for those people that are working from home, and that will be good. But when you evaluate the risks and returns of an investment, that gives you a guide as to what you would like to invest in. And it sounds very easily conceptually, but how do you measure risk? How do you measure return going forward when these are unknown? For me, I think that I could make the case that the risk of being involved in modern slavery and the reputational damage that would come out of that would be something that no superannuation fund would like to bear. So you should not pursue that course of action. And I believe that the risks of being involved in fossil fuels, petroleum production, distribution and otherwise are getting to the stage where the level of risk, the risk being that you get left holding a bunch of assets that are no longer of value when renewable and other clean energy sources take the place of fossil fuels, is a risk that should lead you to hold less of them. And you don't necessarily even have to justify it on return grounds, just on risk grounds. And the fiduciary duty that Louise and I and Chairman Hutton have for all of our members is to get them the best return that they can give. So this is a very topical statement. You'll be aware that one of Australia's largest superannuation funds, REST, R-E-S-T, which looks after retail employees, is involved in a court case. But we at Australian Catholic Super believe that we should integrate ESG into everything that we do, and that ESG should take prominence with all other risks, and that climate change and the risk involved with fossil fuels and things like that maybe even deserve to be lifted to an even higher category than some other investment risks. But at the end of the day, when you're looking at an investment, you should analyse all risks: political risks, country risks, production risks, financial risks, etc. And risks involved with fossil fuels, the environment, etc., should be seen as additional to those. Does that make sense to you, Bernard?
Yep, that makes sense completely.
And Bernard, just to add to Michael there, you know, we as a fund are in the process and have commenced actively starting to assess and measure our footprint. So it's a long process. It's not as simple as just putting your portfolio up and someone does a quick calculation, but it's a process we've started. The board has been very supportive of it, and we will continue to do that. And our managers, you know, in tandem are also doing some of this stuff. So it's not just us alone. The asset management community is also very involved with this, and I would say in many cases are quite progressed down the journey. So, you know, choosing the right managers, as Michael said, we have some quite ESG friendly managers in our portfolio. Choosing the right managers and start to integrate those in the portfolio is also part of the process.
Mm-hmm. There's a question, and you've answered quite a few of these questions that have gone through. There's two I wanted to come to. One from Sally Neves, who works for our Mercy Partners. When will Catholic Super be carbon neutral? And I don't know whether she means the organisation or the investment, but perhaps you could comment on either or both.
Thank you very much, Sally, for the question. And yes, it is something we're considering. Before you can be carbon neutral, you have to, and before you can manage anything, you need to be able to measure it and monitor it. And that's what Louise was referring to, that we've hired an organisation called True Cost. and that's to look at it from our investment portfolio's perspective. And there are other things that we can do where we can invest in companies, such as the Aboriginal Carbon Fund, that actually give us carbon credits involved in that. As an organisation, there are lots of things we need to think about doing, from big picture strategic things all the way down to whether or not when we fly, whether we choose the environmental option, how often we use our cars, what sort of power we purchase for our head office, etc. But certainly it's something that we're looking at, and we certainly intend to measure and monitor our carbon footprint, not just on the investment portfolio, but also our organisation, which, as you know, extends around the whole of Australia.
Yep. Thanks, Michael. And the lightning rod for comment on fossil fuels in Australia has to be Adani mine. It's the one that brings everyone's conversation together. So there's a question here. Does Catholic, it says Catholic Insurance, block investment to the Adani coal mine, but is there any relationship there between superannuation companies and Adani per se? Are you aware?
To my knowledge, we have no direct relationship with Adani, and we do not support it. And even to our detriment, we have acted not to support Adani. For example, we have an interest in the Port of Newcastle, which, as you know, would be responsible for coal loading and other things like that. And shipping and container ports is a big infrastructure asset for many superannuation funds. So as again, to the best of my knowledge, we are not supporters of Adani and have actually, to our detriment, at least in the very short term, taken steps to avoid supporting it.
And for our listeners who weren't on the thing the other day, Tim Buckley was saying that Mr. Adani lost $2 billion in the Adani coal mine, but that's okay because he made $9 billion in his renewable industries inside India. So we know where he's actually putting his money at the moment.
And that's actually, that's an interesting point you raise, that's going on a lot. So, if you think about the recent AGL announcement where they're going to be linking remuneration to reduction in emissions, they're the largest global greenhouse gas emitter in Australia. They have had a lot of pressure and they're reducing them in line with Paris and supporting. Same with BHP going net zero. So a lot of these companies are kind of talking out of both sides of their mouth at this stage, and I think they can all see where the future's headed.
Yeah, so Tim was explaining that, or it might have been Bill actually, that essentially companies are splitting into two and they're allowing the fossil fuel side of the business just to become zombies and die while they're taking the investment as much as possible into the renewable space. So they're actually growing two identities, capitalising on their money while they have it to invest in renewables, but keeping their fossil fuel businesses going while they can until they just change. And Peabody Energy, I think, was a 40% drop in value share value in the last few weeks, I understand.
Just on another subject about divestment, and I'm not sure if your delegation is familiar with the term just transition, but this is also, important for us as investors to consider that as well. So, just blanket divesting may have an impact on the S side of ESG, and so we need to be mindful of that as well.
Yeah. Bruce, do you have any comment on the just transition side of things? I mean, Tim Buckley has talked about this in Newcastle, and we've got Japan and Korea, the largest importers of Australian coal, number one and number two, rapidly decarbonising their economies, and Newcastle coal is supplying into that market. Do you have any comments for that just transition?
I don't. It's difficult to make transitions from one system to another because someone's always going to lose out in some way. So it's a matter of how you do it, and I'm heartened by what Louise and Michael have been saying about how you manage these sorts of things. So I don't have any real insight, and I'm not aware of, there must be literature on it, but I'm not familiar with what the conversation is at the moment. But obviously it's a very major consideration.
Yeah. Could I pose a global question to you? One of the things that Earthcare has been doing in the last couple of years are engaging our diocese administrators who manage the finances within each diocese, and increasingly the diocesan development fund managers actually holders of where the investments go and who they invest with and how they direct that. If you are holding a large portfolio of cash for one of our large dioceses as the financial controller, what would be going through your mind, having listened to what we've just said today? How would you go ahead with managing the monies of the Catholic Church? Open to any comment.
If it's all right, I might start, because it's not unlike the job that Louise and I do already. So I would say that I'd like to point everyone towards some of the topical situations that we've seen with companies that have got themselves in trouble. One that comes to mind is AMP. And I think it's pretty clear that it's important that you take into account values other than short-term financial gain when looking at managing money. And the reason is because ultimately there might be longer-term gains to be had from aligning yourselves with other values. So my messages would be, align yourself with someone that you trust, someone that has an ethos that you believe in, and yet can still continue to make yourself the returns that you need to do the task for which you are given. If you use that money for good purposes, and for good purposes I mean that if you allocate your money to people with better principles, better ethics, in theory, you should reduce their cost of capital and allow them to thrive, and that will be a good thing overall, and it should result, and has resulted in our case, in better returns. And these could be as simple as investing in financial institutions that you think behave in a better way, not investing in ones that you think do the wrong thing, investing in green bonds, investing in well-managed companies, investing in companies that pay their managers, particularly their female workers, fairly. As you would all know, our superannuation fund is almost 70% female. And as a father of 4 daughters, and Louise is also the mother of a daughter, we are very, very keen to make sure that everyone gets a fair and just wage, but particularly females who in the past have not been given a fair shake. So, you know, I think I'm outlining a plan that you can do your job, you can align yourselves with good people and get the sort of returns that you need to pay for the projects and initiatives that you need to fund.
Bruce or Louise, did you have any further comment? Bruce, from your perspective, you know, certainly our big capital cities have, you know, fairly significant archdiocese development funds that they use for lending to schools, to hospitals, to childcare centres, and supporting growth in the Catholic system, 20% of the school system, 40% of the health system. What would your guidance be for development fund managers in this whole new post-COVID environment, and particularly around the what do we call it, the catastrophic changes in our climate situation?
I'm struggling to find a sensible answer to that. It's such a big question. I think to be alert to what is happening in the business community, and particularly to be alert to the pressures on many firms from this economic liberalism, which is often linked to political interests rather than economic interests. Well, there are economic interests involved as well. To be alert to that, but also the sorts of conversations that Michael and Louise have been outlining. What is good business practice? What is the gold standard here? Well, who can we look to and to see how they're doing it? So I think in the religious orders and the diocese, we don't have the professional expertise that the superannuation societies have. And so we really need to take advice. And I would say this, that the more we can involve with church organisations in general, have the expertise of people, as you were saying, Michael, people you can trust and you respect and have good insight and knowledge of the particular fields, the more we can work together on these things, the better. So I would say for, I think not just in the finance industry, but the finance side of things, but in the governance of the church altogether, this is a key plank, or Pope Francis is pushing about not just solidarity, but synodality, walking together, and much more lay involvement in the governance and management of all these church functions.
And Michael or Louise, do you have any examples of this gold standard that Bruce has referred to?
Probably yes. And the best example I could give you of a firm that lives these values and enacts investment in this way is Australian Ethical. They happen to be the person that we selected to manage our responsible investment option, our socially responsible option. And you can go onto their website and see their charter and see what they do. And I certainly would put them up as an example of a company that does the right thing, both in terms of their investments and in terms of how they act personally and professionally. And most importantly, they're a very well-performed and accomplished fund in its own right. There are numerous businesses that do better and worse, and I'm sure we've spoken in passing about some of the ones that have let the side down in terms of their culture and their performance, AMP, Rio, some of the banks, etc. But there are plenty of good people out there, plenty of good firms that are doing the right thing. And unfortunately, there are some that aren't doing the right thing. And hopefully over time, the fact that we will choose to support those that do the right thing will be an incentive for them to improve themselves.
Okay. I've got a question here that came in very much earlier and I'll direct it to Bruce. So this comes from Noel Gregory. Can I ask Bruce, how will a just recovery be assisted by bringing forward income tax concessions and the government's building of a gas-fired power station in the Hunter Valley?
Thank you, Noel.
That's a rhetorical one sometimes.
I think so. I think the general feeling, well, the advice among in the energy sector is that gas is actually highly polluting, and some would say it's even worse than coal because it emits so much methane, which is 30 times, 20 or 30 times worse than carbon dioxide. So I think there's not much debate about that in the scientific circles, but of course there are political interests pushing this at the moment. And the other question was about, what was it?
Yeah, about the bringing forward income tax concessions to help with that post-COVID recovery.
Well, it's like a free kick, isn't it? The income tax concessions will mainly benefit higher income groups who will tend to save the extra income that they receive instead of spending it, and it will mean it would be much better to disperse this money to lower income groups, middle and lower income groups who are going to spend the money, and it would also help lift their standard of living and increase demand, which would then flow on to the general economy and help the recovery. Helping the more wealthy, the wealthier end of the scale overwhelmingly does very little to help the economy. So I think that would be the general opinion among economists as well.
Sure. And I know Michael, Louise is not necessarily your area, but if you wish to make a comment, please do so.
It is actually my area. And I would love to comment, and I 100% agree with Bruce. In very simple terms, if you give any form of assistance to people who have a high marginal propensity to spend, that money gets circulated through the economy, and it's also socially just and a good thing to do. You would have seen in the recent economic figures that unfortunately one of the things that's happened as a result of COVID is that Australians are saving money, and the savings ratio is almost tripled. That is a very bad thing, because if you're trying to inject stimulus and you'd like that money to circulate through the economy, you don't want to give it to people who are just going to save. And so I think that from my personal point of view, is the government should be concentrating its benefits towards the lower end, where that money will benefit the economy more. So I think that's pretty much in line with what Bruce was saying.
Yeah, well, that's great. And I must refer back to, Michael, to your opening statement that superannuation is a social justice action unto itself, and the provision of superannuation to assist in that retirement is a notion that I actually hadn't really looked at, because I guess I've been brought up in an era of superannuation per se since I started teaching. Although initially it was the AMPs of the world that wanted to offer all that superannuation and take the heavy slice of the cake as you paid your first few payments.
And that's why, as the television ads say, you know, you should deal with an industry super fund. Our fund is an industry super fund, and just as you would in every other aspect of your life, choose a partner that you can trust and choose a good super fund, and maybe stay away from those potential partners like AMP that have done the wrong thing.
Doesn't this come down to what we've talked about prior, Michael, about human behaviour, that we join an organisation in our work, we pick up the allocated superannuation, nominated superannuation company for that, and we go into a balanced portfolio. Everything's done for us. And then we set and we forget until we get close to retirement, and then we start to panic and start to look at ways of increasing our superannuation portfolio. Do you see that sort of, or do you experience that sort of portfolio, that portfolio management from these phone calls that you get in and out of your company?
What I can tell you is that Australia as a nation does not spend as much time on something that is likely to be their second largest financial asset, namely their superannuation. I have a 28-year-old daughter who's not that interested in her superannuation because she sees it as something that's a long, long way away. We tend to get a lot more interest from our members as they get either to an age or to a position where they're nearing retirement, generally around 50 years old, and that's when there's a lot more activity. And that is why we as a fund are spending a lot more time in trying to produce products that help people on their journey, such as our award-winning default superannuation product called Lifetime One, but also in having retirement products, because with an ageing population, baby boomers and the rest, the eldest 10% of the population in super world own 60, 70% of the money, because they're the older people with larger balances. And I'm sure you'll see a lot more action by superannuation funds into retirement products in the near future, especially as the government is going to legislate that we all have to have a thing called a CIPR, a CIPR, comprehensive income product for retirement, by 2022.
So can you just explain what that CIPR is again?
Every superannuation fund will have to produce by 2022 a product that is seen as a suitable product for retirement, and how that suitability will be judged will be to do with income and longevity.
Okay.
And obviously, you know, speaking on behalf of a fund that predominantly looks after female school teachers, people who, in my opinion, don't earn as much money as they deserve, the only way that we can help them to retire with dignity is to give them the best performance and the best products to serve those purposes.
I understand from reading a bit that the greatest interest in ethical investment, particularly a non-fossil fuel one, is coming from the younger age groups of investment, yet they hold the least amount of money, so are less likely to change the course of investment overall. Do you have data on the number of younger superannuation account holders who really push into that area?
As a superannuation fund that does its own administration, we have wonderful data on our members and what they do and how they move. You're absolutely correct that our younger members are seen as having a higher level of interest in these sorts of activities and are more likely to buy an ESG option and are more likely to vote with their feet. I'd love to think that the members who are young now will, over the passage of time, become older members with larger balances, and so it's well worth the investment to progress our ESG options across the whole fund. But obviously the numbers are small, because if I've told you that the top 10% of members own 75% of the money, that the numbers are very large though. And just like in that example of helping everybody, sometimes it's not just about money, it's about helping the larger number of our members.
Yeah. And I need to sort of start drawing a close. I'm just getting a text message saying, I think you might be booked for other meetings straight after this one. So I really appreciate your time today. I'm just wondering, Bruce, Louise or Michael, did you want any closing statements that you would like to make about what we can do as individuals in this space?
As I said before, I think the most important thing for everybody to do is to vote with their feet and support those organisations that are honest, ethical and just and will do the right thing, because these small initiatives from every person will help in the long run.
They will all add up. Yep.
Absolutely.
And we talk about your locus of control, your circle of influence, your area of concern. And we know our young people spend a lot of time in this area of concern, but they have virtually little control of that. They want to change the world economic system yesterday, and it doesn't quite work that way. So you've talked about something that was within our locus of control, and I guess the other circle is our circle of influence. Who do we know? Who has connections to other people? So we can spread these messages ourselves. And the strong message from previous sessions is go book your 15 minutes of fame with your local politician if you want to influence policy. And I guess from this session, book your 15 minutes of fame with your own superannuation account and make some decisions for your own future, but also for the planet. I don't know whether Bruce and Louise, you wanted to add anything more?
I'm sorry, Louise.
I was just going to say, just to understand that, there's so many members and many members want to do different things or want their fund to do different things. So to have the confidence that we are, picking our battles, we are aligning with collaborative organisations that are acting as a collective voice on some of these issues. You might not see us in the press speaking as a fund, but we are part of collectives that are. So just to understand that that's where we're sitting in amongst there, and to have the confidence that that's what we're doing.
Thanks, Louise. And Bruce?
Thank you, Louise. I'd just like to add two quick points. One is, I think, as you're aware, Pope Francis is about to issue a new encyclical on these issues, and particularly the international economy in the light of the COVID crisis. So I think this is an astonishingly perilous moment for the international economy. And for, if we do not get this right, you sort of dread what might come of it. And particularly link this up with the second point is, remember Pope Francis, when he addressed the United Nations, immediately after that, they went to vote for the delegates for the Sustainable Development Goals. Laudato Si was written in collaboration with the architects of the Sustainable Development Goals. this is the practical how to do these great things are really reforming the international economy along the lines that Michael and Louise have been talking about, the socially responsible and looking at universal good, uplifting living standards everywhere and achieving a much more just and fairer world. I don't think we've paid enough attention in this country to the Sustainable Development Goals. I think most people never even heard of them, yet I think they're tremendously important about how we move forward. And I just commend Caritas and others for the work that they're doing to make these better known.
And I guess for Michael and Louise, maybe the Sustainable Development Goals, are they part of your platform, or they are referred to loosely, or are they tightly bound? I'm unsure.
Bernard, as and when you integrate ESG into your entire platform, the 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals are certainly things that we all aspire to.
And you'll be pleased to know in my office, they're on my pin board.
That's wonderful. Well,
thanks very much, Bernard.
On that note, we all agree, and as this session's about bringing our hearts together to care for our common home, and this has been the third element of our finance, economics and politics component. I'd like to thank very much Bruce, beaming in from Melbourne and in lockdown, and I hope you get your 2 hours of exercise after this, Bruce. And Louise and Michael from Australian Catholic Superannuation Retirement Fund. And really appreciate your time. This session is recorded for everyone who's online at the moment, and they'll be able to watch it within a couple of days from our website. So thank you very much again, and people can. We can't answer all the questions, but you can see them in there, and I think we've covered a lot of them pretty comprehensively. So thank you once again, everybody. And we peaked at about 82 people today, and resting at 70 now. So it's lovely to have all those people online with us.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Always like watching the numbers go down, Bruce. 26, 25,
yeah,
24.
They're all feeling.
They get to tell jokes now, and they hang around a bit longer.
Anyway, Bernard, thanks very much. You did that brilliantly, monitoring the group, and very friendly face. So that went well.
It's all to be friendly. I mean, we're just trying to work our way how we go forward, and you've got to form good partnerships with people to keep going. We don't know where the conversation goes or what opportunities will arise that we then prosecute. But we know that we can take some of this video footage, and I'm going to package it. Well, someone's going to package it anyway in a way which I can then send to our Archdiocese Development Fund people and our diocese administrators and say, hey, you probably couldn't come to the convocation, but here's a little 30-minute highlight reel. Any of these people, apart from Ross, Tim, Bill, Yen, they'll all dialogue with you about finances and give you some assistance if you wish to have that. So,
that's marvelous.
Yeah.
Good.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you again. Bye.